My name is Emma Turner. I'm in my late 30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've been described with the same small handful of words. Steady, reasonable, low maintenance. The kind of woman people trust with responsibilities, but rarely with the truth. The kind who keeps things running quietly in the background while louder personalities take up the space in the room. I work in operations, systems, schedules, details that only become visible when they fail. At home, I played a similar role. Reliable, calm, the emotional ballast. People often assume that means I'm passive or that I don't notice much. That if I'm not reacting, I must not be thinking. They're wrong about that. This story isn't dramatic in the way movies teach us to expect. There are no screaming matches, no slammed doors, no sudden villain reveal. It's quieter than that. Slower. And because of that, it took me a long time to see it clearly myself. I discovered the truth about our marriage. And it wasn't an accident. That sentence still feels strange to say out loud, because for years I believed what I was experiencing were misunderstandings. Personality differences, bad timing, stress, normal wear and tear. But eventually, a different sentence formed in my mind, one I could no longer ignore. What I thought were mistakes turned out to be deliberate choices. This is not a revenge story. I'm not here to embarrass anyone or to relitigate old arguments. I'm not even here to paint myself as a hero. I'm telling this because there's a particular kind of emotional injustice that thrives on silence and good intentions. And because many people living inside it don't realize that's where they are. Over the next hour, I'm going to walk you through how I slowly recognized the patterns in my marriage, how I understood the role I had been assigned without my consent, how silence, once a habit, became a decision, and how clarity, real clarity, arrived not with rage, but with stillness. You won't hear me exaggerate. I won't raise my voice. There are no villains here. Just choices and consequences unfolding at different speeds. Some of them are mine. If you're listening to this because you feel underestimated, because something in your life feels subtly off but hard to explain, or because you've ever wondered whether calm can be a form of strength, then you might recognize parts of yourself along the way. Before we begin the story itself, I want to introduce you properly to who I was at the start, on paper and beneath the surface. And as you listen, I'll leave you with one gentle question to hold in the back of your mind. Have you ever been so busy being reasonable that you delayed being honest with yourself? For a long time, I thought being easy to live with was a virtue. I was the woman people described as low drama, and they meant it as a compliment. Friends would say it admiringly, my husband would say it with relief, and even my in-laws would smile when they said, "Emma never makes things complicated." I wore that label carefully, like something fragile that could break if I questioned it too hard. To them, I was the stabilizer. In social settings, I was the one who remembered birthdays, smoothed over awkward moments, and noticed when someone felt left out. At work, I was dependable to the point of invisibility. If something went wrong, I fixed it quietly. If something went right, it was assumed it would have anyway. I didn't push myself forward. I didn't interrupt. I didn't demand credit. I thought competence spoke for itself. In my marriage, this translated into a very specific role. I was the one who adapted. If plans changed, I adjusted. If moods shifted, I compensated. If something felt off, I told myself it wasn't worth turning into a conversation. I believed that love meant flexibility, and that being understanding was the same thing as being respected. Looking back now, I can see how neatly that belief served everyone but me. When people looked at us from the outside, they saw a balanced couple. My husband was charismatic, decisive, and socially confident. I was calm, thoughtful, and supportive. The contrast made sense to them. It made sense to me too, at least at first. What I didn't realize was how often calm became a synonym for doesn't object. I became the person whose preferences were optional. Not ignored outright, just gently bypassed. Restaurants were chosen without asking me because you're fine with anything. Decisions were made quickly because you trust my judgment. Small dismissals layered themselves into our daily life so smoothly that they barely registered as dismissals at all. And the thing is, I didn't feel angry. Not then. I felt reasonable. I told myself stories to make it all coherent. He's just decisive. I'm just more adaptable. This is how healthy couples work. One leads, one supports. I had 1,000 explanations ready, and they all sounded mature, balanced, adult. What I didn't have was language for what was missing. No one saw me as unhappy, not even me. I was useful, appreciated, and relied upon. People leaned on me emotionally and logistically. That felt like being needed, and being needed felt close enough to being loved. But there's a difference between being valued and being considered. At gatherings, I noticed how conversations flowed around me. I'd contribute something thoughtful, and someone louder would talk over it. The topic would move on. No one meant harm. No one apologized either. I learned to finish my thoughts internally instead of out loud. At home, I noticed how often my husband spoke in conclusions instead of questions. We'll do this. It makes more sense that way. Trust me. And I did trust him until trust slowly replaced participation. If I hesitated, he'd smile and say, "You're overthinking it." And because I'd spent my life being praised for not overthinking, I let that sentence land as reassurance instead of dismissal. This is the part that's hardest to explain. Nothing felt wrong enough to protest. There was no single moment where I could point and say, "That's where it broke." Instead, there was a gradual narrowing of space, of voice, of presence. I was still there, still functioning, still contributing, but I was doing it from the edges. I became predictable in a way that benefited everyone else. Reliable reactions, measured responses, no surprises. And because I didn't object, people assumed I agreed. Because I stayed calm, they assumed I was unaffected. Because I didn't demand, they assumed I didn't need. That was who I was to them. Invisible, not because I was weak, but because I made it easy not to look too closely. At the time, I thought this meant I was emotionally intelligent, mature, secure. It never occurred to me that my silence was teaching people exactly how far they could go without resistance. I wasn't ignored. I was accounted for as a constant, as background stability, as someone who would always be there, no matter how the foreground shifted. And the most unsettling truth is this: I helped build that version of myself. The first time it happened, I almost missed it. That's what makes it so easy to dismiss now, even in hindsight. If I told someone the details, they might shrug and say it was nothing. And at the time, I would have agreed with them. We were at a small dinner with friends, nothing formal. A weeknight, familiar faces. The kind of evening where everyone talks at once, and no one is really listening all the way through. Someone asked how we decided to move neighborhoods a few years back. It wasn't a big question, just casual conversation. Before I could answer, my husband spoke. He told the story confidently, smoothly, as if it were well rehearsed. He explained why the area made sense, how the timing worked, and what we were thinking back then. He laughed at one point and said, "Emma was hesitant at first, but I convinced her." People nodded. Someone smiled at me and said, "Well, it turned out great." I smiled back. What I didn't say was that I hadn't been hesitant. I'd had serious concerns, practical ones, long-term ones. I hadn't needed convincing, I'd needed discussion. The decision hadn't been mutual in the way the story suggested. It had been presented, framed, and finalized. But I didn't correct him. Not because I was afraid, and not because I felt silenced in the obvious sense. I didn't interrupt because it felt unnecessary. The story was already moving. Everyone seemed comfortable with his version. Challenging it would have required a level of insistence I wasn't used to bringing into rooms like that. So I let it go. That was the cut. Small, clean, almost painless. On the drive home, I noticed a faint tightness in my chest. Not anger exactly, but something unsettled. A sense of being misrepresented in a way that mattered just enough to feel off, but not enough to justify a conversation. I told myself a familiar line. He didn't mean it like that. That phrase became a kind of emotional balm. I used it generously. He didn't mean it. It wasn't intentional. It wasn't important. And maybe in isolation it wasn't. The problem wasn't the moment itself. It was how easily everyone accepted a version of me that wasn't quite true, and how easily I allowed it. Later that night, I almost brought it up. We were getting ready for bed, the house quiet, the moment neutral. I could have said, hey, that's not really how it happened. It would have been calm, reasonable, accurate. But I imagined the response before it arrived. A light laugh, a dismissal. You're reading too much into it, or worse, confusion. Why does that even matter? And suddenly I was the one making things heavy, complicated, disruptive. So I stayed quiet. That's the thing about the first small cut. It doesn't bleed. It just teaches you something. It teaches you what's worth mentioning and what's easier to absorb. It teaches you how much space your perspective is allowed to take up before it becomes inconvenient. After that, I noticed other moments like it. Stories retold with details smoothed out. Decisions framed as mutual after the fact. My role was reduced to agreement instead of contribution. Each instance was minor. Each one had a perfectly reasonable explanation. And every time I told myself the same thing, this is not a hill worth dying on. What I didn't see yet was that I was slowly giving up hills altogether. Everyone else ignored these moments because they were small. And because I ignored them too. There was no confrontation, no tension, no sign that anything was wrong. From the outside, our relationship looked harmonious. Inside, something subtle had shifted. A kind of internal recalibration. I began to measure my responses more carefully, to decide in advance which thoughts were worth voicing and which ones would only create friction. I told myself this was emotional intelligence, choosing peace over ego. But peace, I would later learn, can be one-sided. At the time, though, I still believed the best version of the story. I believed that misunderstandings happened, that love was flexible, that not every truth needed airtime. I didn't know yet that the smallest cuts are often the most dangerous, because they teach you to tolerate the shape of what comes next. After the first small cut, nothing changed on the surface, and that, more than anything, reassured me. Life continued with its familiar rhythm. Work deadlines, shared routines, weekend plans. There was no fallout, no argument, no sign that something had gone wrong. If anything, things felt smoother, easier. I told myself that was proof I'd handled the situation well. What I didn't realize was that I had just set a precedent. Disrespect doesn't usually arrive loudly. It doesn't announce itself as cruelty. It comes dressed as efficiency, confidence, practicality. It repeats itself softly until it no longer sounds like a problem. I started to notice how often my perspective was summarized instead of being invited. We talked about this, he'd say, when what he meant was that he'd explained it. You agreed, when what I'd done was stop pushing. It's better this way, said with such certainty that questioning it felt like questioning reality itself. And each time I nodded, not because I was convinced, but because I was tired of being the only one slowing things down. I began to pre-edit myself. I'd feel a hesitation rise, a thought forming, and I'd weigh it quickly. Is this worth the energy? Will this change anything? Most of the time, the answer felt like no, so I stayed quiet. I adjusted, I adapted. The dangerous part was how reasonable it all sounded in my own head. I told myself I was choosing harmony. Those relationships require compromise. That I was strong enough not to need constant validation. I framed my silence as generosity. And in doing so, I made it invisible, even to myself. The pattern became predictable. He would decide. I would consider objecting. I would rationalize why it wasn't necessary. And then I would live with the outcome. Over time, I stopped noticing the decision points altogether. They blended into the background. What once would have felt like being overlooked began to feel normal, expected, almost natural. I adjusted my expectations downward without realizing I was doing it. I learned which opinions would be welcomed and which ones would be brushed aside. I learned to offer only the first kind. When friends asked for advice, I was thoughtful and precise. When my husband asked for input, it was often already framed with an answer attached. Don't you think this makes more sense? It was less a question than a test of alignment, and I passed that test again and again. There was a subtle reward for this behavior. Things stayed calm. I was praised for being understanding, flexible, and easy to be with. Those words landed like approval, like proof that I was doing something right. But underneath that approval, something eroded. I began to feel strangely distant from my own reactions, as if I were observing my life rather than participating in it. I noticed that when decisions affected me deeply, my first instinct wasn't to speak. It was to adjust internally. I stopped expecting to be consulted. I started expecting to be informed. And that expectation shaped everything. There were moments when a flicker of resentment surfaced, but I pushed it down quickly. Resentment felt immature, unproductive. I didn't want to be that person, the one who nitpicked, who complained, who made everything emotional. So I reframed. I minimized. I told myself that this was just how relationships evolved, that intensity faded, that this was adulthood. The truth was quieter and more uncomfortable. I was being slowly trained to disappear in plain sight, and because I participated willingly, no one questioned it. Why would they? There was no resistance, no visible harm, just a woman who seemed content to go along. I still believed my marriage was built on mutual respect. I believed we were equals. I believed that if something truly mattered, I would speak up. What I didn't see yet was that I'd already taught myself not to recognize what truly mattered, because recognizing it would require me to confront how often it had been ignored. This is how disrespect becomes normalized. Not through cruelty, but through repetition. Through the steady dulling of your internal alarms. Through the quiet conviction that asking for more would be unreasonable. By the time I realized something was wrong, the pattern had been in place for years. And it felt normal. That was the most unsettling part of all. It wasn't a single moment of realization. It was more like a gradual recognition. The way you notice a room has been rearranged only after you trip over furniture that used to be somewhere else. I began to see that there was a version of me everyone seemed to agree on, without ever asking if I did. In that version, I was the steady one, the reasonable one, the person who didn't need much. I was expected to absorb stress, smooth edges, and make things easier for everyone else. And because I had done those things so well for so long, they stopped being appreciated and started being assumed. This wasn't just in my marriage. It echoed everywhere. At work, I was the person handed complicated problems with little context and tight deadlines. You'll figure it out, they'd say. And I did. Not because it was fair, but because it was expected. When success came, it was treated as confirmation that the workload had been appropriate. When exhaustion followed, it was treated as irrelevant. At home, the role was even more defined. I was the emotional regulator. If there was tension, it was my job to soften it. If something went unsaid, it was my responsibility to understand it anyway. I became fluent in reading between the lines, while no one bothered to read mine. What struck me most was how unconscious it all seemed. No one sat me down and assigned me this role. No one explicitly demanded that I be invisible. They simply responded to the version of me I had consistently presented. And that version was useful, reliable, flexible, non-confrontational. I realized that people didn't just expect me to be this way, they depended on it. Their comfort relied on my compliance. Their efficiency relied on my silence. Their image of harmony relied on my restraint. Once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. There were moments when I tried to step slightly outside the role, small deviations, a firmer opinion, a pause instead of an immediate yes. The reactions were subtle but unmistakable. Surprise, mild irritation, confusion, not anger, something more revealing than that, discomfort. It was as if I'd broken an unspoken agreement. As if my job wasn't just to contribute, but to do so without friction, without taking up space, without requiring adjustment from anyone else. That was when I understood the real function of the role I'd been assigned. I wasn't there to be fully present. I was there to be supportive, to facilitate, to make other people's lives easier, smoother, and more manageable. And because I did it quietly, it didn't look like a sacrifice. It looked like personality. I began to recognize how often my needs were framed as optional. How often were my preferences treated as flexible suggestions rather than real boundaries? If I wanted something different, it required justification, explanation, proof that it was worth the inconvenience. Meanwhile, other people's wants moved straight into action. The imbalance wasn't aggressive, it was procedural, and that made it harder to challenge. You can argue with cruelty, you can confront disrespect when it's loud. But how do you push back against a system that runs smoothly because you've been oiling the gears? I saw how often I was praised for being understanding, how that word was only ever used when I accepted less. No one called me understanding when I expressed a clear need. Then I was sensitive or overthinking. That contrast lingered with me. I realized I had been rewarded for shrinking, and the most difficult part was admitting that I had accepted those rewards. I liked being seen as mature. I liked being the one people relied on. I liked the sense of moral superiority that came with being calm while others were reactive. But that calm had come at a cost. I wasn't showing up fully anymore. I was performing a role that made me predictable and easy to manage. And because I'd played it so well, everyone assumed it was who I truly was, including me. Understanding this didn't make me angry. It made me quiet in a different way. Observant, alert, I started paying attention not just to what was said, but to what was expected of me before I even spoke. And that's when something subtle began to shift. Not in my behavior yet, but in my awareness. I was no longer just living inside the role. I was watching it from the outside. The day something shifted wasn't dramatic. There was no argument, no revelation delivered in a raised voice. In fact, if you had been watching from the outside, you would have seen nothing at all. It happened on an ordinary afternoon. I was alone in the house, sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop open but untouched. A half-finished cup of tea had gone cold beside me. I wasn't sad, I wasn't angry, I was just still. That stillness was new. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't trying to interpret anyone else's mood or anticipate what would be needed next. I wasn't adjusting my thoughts to fit someone else's expectations. I was simply present with my own. And in that quiet, a question surfaced, one I hadn't allowed myself to ask before. When was the last time I was chosen, not tolerated, not accommodated, not included as an afterthought? Chosen. I tried to answer honestly, and nothing came immediately to mind. That absence spoke louder than any accusation. I began replaying moments from the past few years, not emotionally, but analytically, like reviewing footage. I noticed how often my needs entered conversations as variables rather than priorities, how frequently my presence was assumed rather than appreciated. I saw how decisions unfolded with my consent, but rarely with my authorship. And suddenly the narrative I'd been telling myself didn't hold up anymore. I had believed that I was quiet because I was secure, that I didn't push because I didn't need to, that my calm meant I was unaffected. But sitting there with no one else around to perform for, I recognized something else entirely. I had been managing disappointment so efficiently that I'd mistaken it for peace. That realization didn't hurt the way you might expect. It didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like clarity, clean, undeniable. I wasn't being seen, not fully, and I hadn't been for a long time. What surprised me most was how calm I felt once I admitted that. There was no urge to confront anyone, no impulse to demand change or explain myself. The need for validation evaporated the moment I stopped pretending things were fine. Instead, something else took its place: attention. I became acutely aware of how much energy I had spent maintaining equilibrium for everyone else. How much of my internal life had been compressed into something palatable and unobtrusive. And I realized that if nothing changed, this would simply continue, quietly, indefinitely. That thought didn't scare me, it focused me. I closed my laptop without saving anything and stood up from the table. I remember noticing the sound of the chair legs against the floor, the way the light fell across the counter. Everything felt sharper, as if my senses had recalibrated. I didn't make any promises to myself that day. No declarations, no ultimatums. I didn't even decide what I would do next. All I did was stop lying to myself. I acknowledged for the first time that the imbalance I felt wasn't imagined or exaggerated. It was structural, It was embedded in the way my relationships functioned, and it wasn't going to resolve itself through more patience. That day marked the end of something, not my marriage, not yet, but my participation in a story that required my erasure. From that moment on, my silence began to feel different. It wasn't automatic anymore. It wasn't driven by habit or fear of disruption. It became intentional. I didn't speak less. I listened more carefully. I noticed who checked in and who assumed, who asked and who concluded, who adapted and who expected adaptation as their due. And in that noticing, I felt a quiet sense of control return, not over anyone else, but over myself. Nothing on the outside changed that day. No one commented. No one sensed a shift. The house looked the same. My marriage continued as it had. But internally, the ground had moved. And once that happens, even subtly, things don't go back to the way they were. After that afternoon, my silence changed its character. Before, it had been reflexive, something I slipped into without noticing, the way you fall into a familiar posture. Now it requires intention. Each time I chose not to speak, I was aware of the choice itself. That awareness altered everything. I stopped filling gaps automatically. When conversations drifted toward decisions, I let them. When assumptions were made, I noted them without correcting them right away. I wasn't withdrawing, I was observing. And because I wasn't reacting, people began to misread me. They mistook my stillness for agreement. This wasn't new, but now I saw it clearly. When I didn't object, plans solidified quickly. My lack of resistance was interpreted as alignment. The system continued to function as it always had, efficiently, comfortably, for everyone else. The difference was that I was no longer emotionally invested in maintaining that comfort. I started keeping quiet records, not physical ones at first, just mental notes. Who consulted me? Who informed me after the fact? Who noticed when I didn't volunteer solutions? Who didn't? I noticed how rarely anyone asked, "What do you think?" without already leaning toward an answer. I also noticed how often my husband spoke for me. He'd summarize my position in conversations, sometimes accurately, sometimes not, but always confidently, and people accepted it because I didn't interrupt. Each time it happened, I felt a familiar urge to clarify, and each time I chose not to. Not because I was afraid, but because I was learning. I wanted to understand the full shape of the pattern before I touched it. Silence, when chosen consciously, has a different weight. It creates space. It allows other people to reveal themselves without interference. And in that space, behaviors repeat themselves with remarkable consistency. What I learned was sobering. My absence from the conversation rarely slowed anything down. Decisions still got made. Plans still moved forward. My presence had been seen as supportive, not essential. The structure didn't need my voice. It only needed my compliance. And when that compliance was quietly withdrawn, no one noticed. Not at first. That told me everything. There was a strange sense of relief in this phase. I no longer felt responsible for correcting narratives or smoothing edges. I let misunderstandings stand. I let assumptions run their course. I wasn't being passive-aggressive. I wasn't setting traps. I was simply stepping out of a role that had required constant emotional labor. At the same time, I became more precise in the moments when I did speak. I stopped offering tentative language. I didn't over-explain. I didn't soften my statements with apologies. The contrast was subtle, but it landed. When I spoke less, people listened more carefully because they weren't used to it. Still, no one asked what had changed. That was another lesson. Change that doesn't disrupt convenience often goes unexamined. I realized that my previous visibility had been conditional. I was seen when I was useful, agreeable, stabilizing. When I stopped performing those functions automatically, I became background again, but now by my own design. And that shift gave me leverage I hadn't expected. I could see the system clearly because I was no longer trying to fix it from inside. I could anticipate reactions before they happened. I could predict which silences would be filled by others, and how. My husband, in particular, grew more certain of himself. With less feedback from me, he seemed to assume there was less to consider. His decisions became faster, broader, and less nuanced. He thought he was operating efficiently. What he didn't realize was that I was watching patterns solidify, patterns that would soon have consequences he hadn't anticipated. This phase wasn't about control, it was about information. I needed to know whether the imbalance I'd felt was circumstantial or fundamental, whether it would correct itself if I stepped back, or whether it would deepen. Silence gave me the answer. It deepened. And once I understood that, I knew I couldn't return to the old version of myself. Not because I was angry, but because I was no longer confused. Silence had stopped being a default. It had become a tool. What they never noticed was how much I was paying attention. Because I wasn't reacting, it looked like nothing was happening. From the outside, I appeared unchanged, still calm, still present, still cooperative enough to avoid raising questions. But internally, something had shifted into focus. I stopped assuming good intentions were enough. I began documenting reality as it was, not as I hoped it might be. At first, this documentation was informal. I wrote things down in my notebook, dates, decisions, phrasing, not out of spite or suspicion, but out of a need for accuracy. I wanted to know whether the patterns I was seeing were consistent or imagined. They were consistent. I noticed how often conversations followed the same arc. Input requested late, if at all. Decisions framed as settled. My agreement is assumed. When I disagreed quietly, it was treated as hesitation and rather than opposition. When I raised concerns, they were reframed as anxiety. I began to see how language was being used. Not maliciously, but strategically. Words like we and together appeared after decisions had already been made. Phrases like, "You're good with this," replaced actual questions. None of this looked alarming in isolation. Together, they formed a structure. I also started paying attention to logistics, finances, timelines, commitments. Who signed what? Who had access? Who was informed first? Who was expected to adapt afterward? This wasn't paranoia, it was clarity. The more I observed, the more I realized how much I'd been managing behind the scenes. How many small safeguards I'd put in place over the years without thinking of them as such. How often I'd been the one anticipating problems before they surfaced. And how invisible that labor had been. I didn't confront anyone with this information. I didn't hint or threaten. I didn't change my demeanor. I simply continued to gather data. What surprised me was how little resistance there was. My silence didn't prompt curiosity. It prompted confidence. My husband grew more comfortable making unilateral decisions. He spoke more freely about plans that assumed my continued flexibility. He never asked if I was still okay with them. That told me something important. If my participation had truly been valued, its absence would have been felt. Instead, my quiet compliance had been mistaken for permanence. I also noticed how other people responded. Friends would check in less. Invitations were extended with less consideration. The assumption was that I'd fit myself around whatever was happening. And I did outwardly, but internally I was repositioning. I began organizing my thoughts around contingencies. What would happen if I stopped compensating? If I didn't smooth over misunderstandings? If I prioritized my own clarity over shared comfort? I started reviewing documents I hadn't looked at in years. Agreements, records, details that had always been handled. I wasn't looking for wrongdoing. I was looking for understanding. And that's when I realized something crucial. I wasn't powerless. I just never needed to exercise power before. My strength had always been quiet, procedural, and long-term. I understood systems. I saw how small decisions compounded. I knew where things connected and where they didn't. That was my leverage. And because it didn't look like dominance, no one had been watching for it. This phase wasn't about planning an exit. Not yet. It was about seeing the full picture, understanding the architecture of my life as it actually existed, not as it was described to others. There was no satisfaction in this discovery, no sense of triumph, just a growing stillness, the kind that comes when you stop arguing with reality. I realized that the imbalance in my marriage wasn't accidental. It hadn't emerged from miscommunication or stress. It was the result of repeated choices, some conscious, some habitual, that all pointed in the same direction. toward convenience for one and accommodation for the other. And because I had made myself so adaptable, those choices had gone unchallenged. What they never noticed was that adaptability can be withdrawn, quietly, methodically, without confrontation. By the time I finished this phase of observation, I wasn't confused anymore. I wasn't even hurt in the way I might have expected. I was informed, and information, when paired with patience, changes the balance of any system. I didn't rush the next step. I didn't need to, because once you see clearly, time stops working against you. The reveal didn't arrive with a surge of emotion. There was no moment where my heart raced or my hands shook. When it finally came, it felt almost quiet, as if something I had already sensed simply finished taking shape. I was sitting alone again, this time not at the kitchen table, but on the floor of my home office, surrounded by folders I hadn't touched in years. Paperwork I'd once trusted to exist without my attention. Things I'd assumed were settled because they'd been described that way. I wasn't looking for proof of betrayal. I wasn't expecting to uncover anything dramatic. What I was doing was verifying reality, and that was when the full picture emerged. What I discovered wasn't a single lie. It was alignment. A pattern so consistent it could no longer be explained away as a coincidence or oversight. Decisions that had been framed as mutual were, in fact, strategically unilateral. Agreements had been structured in ways that favored speed and control over collaboration. My consent had been implied, not confirmed. Nothing illegal, nothing overtly unethical, just deliberate. I realized that my role in the marriage hadn't drifted into place accidentally. It had been shaped, gradually, patiently, around my willingness to adapt. My silence had not merely been tolerated, it had been relied upon. The truth settled in without shock. This wasn't a misunderstanding, it was designed. That sentence didn't make me angry, it made me still. I sat with the documents spread out around me, noticing how calm my breathing was. I felt grounded, alert, as if I had stepped out of fog and into clean air. There was no urge to confront, no desire to expose or accuse. Confrontation would have required me to explain something to someone who had benefited from not seeing it. Instead, I felt something else take hold. Clarity stripped of sentiment. I could now trace how choices had been made when options were available. How has convenience been prioritized over fairness? How my reputation for being easy had been quietly leveraged. And I understood something else too. This had only worked because I had been consistent, because I didn't escalate, because I didn't demand, because I believed good faith would eventually balance things out. It hadn't. What struck me most was how impersonal it all felt. There was no sense of malice, just efficiency. A system that had learned what it could get away with and continued accordingly. That realization changed how I saw everything. I wasn't dealing with cruelty. I was dealing with a structure that rewarded silence and penalized disruption. And I had been quietly maintaining that structure for years. The reveal wasn't about discovering leverage over someone else. It was about discovering leverage within the system. I saw clearly where my participation mattered, where my absence would create friction, where assumptions would begin to fail. And because I understood systems, I knew that once friction appeared, outcomes changed. I didn't smile. I didn't feel triumphant. I closed the folders carefully, stacked them neatly, and put them back where they belonged. No one knew what I had learned. That privacy was important. This wasn't information to be shared impulsively. It wasn't a weapon. It was orientation, a map. And with a map, you don't announce your destination before you start moving. That night, my husband talked about future plans as if they were settled facts, timelines, expectations. "We'll do this," he said. "It makes sense." I listened, I nodded, I didn't challenge him. But something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer responding to the story he was telling. I was responding to the reality I had confirmed. And once you know the difference between those two things, you don't need to rush. You don't need to argue. You don't need to prove anything. You just need to decide. The reveal wasn't explosive. It was definitive. The decision point didn't arrive as a fork in the road. It was more like standing still and realizing that every path forward required movement I could no longer postpone. Once the truth was clear, Doing nothing was no longer neutral. It became a choice in itself. I spent days, not agonizing, but assessing. I laid out the options quietly in my mind, the way I do with any complex system, not emotionally, structurally. One option was to confront everything directly, lay out what I'd seen, demand explanations, insist on change. It was the most obvious path, and in many ways, the most socially acceptable. It would have cast me in a familiar role, the reasonable woman finally speaking up. But when I imagined it honestly, I knew what it would lead to. Explanations, justifications, reframing, promises, a temporary rebalancing driven by discomfort rather than understanding, and eventually a return to equilibrium, the same one I'd been propping up for years. That path required me to keep managing. Another option was to accept things as they were, to continue adapting, to tell myself that clarity alone was enough, that I could live alongside the structure without challenging it. That option felt calm on the surface and hollow underneath. It would have required me to unsee what I had already seen, to re-enter a story that depended on my silence, now fully aware of its cost. I knew I couldn't do that. The third option was the quietest and the most irreversible. It involved no confrontation, no announcement, no emotional display. Just alignment between my inner clarity and my outward actions. It meant withdrawing my participation from a system that functioned only because I supported it. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but completely. This wasn't about punishment. It wasn't about making a point. It was about integrity. I realized that staying without agency was no longer kindness. It was self-betrayal. And confronting without leverage would only restart a cycle I already understood too well. So I chose the option that didn't require permission. I chose to move in a way that didn't depend on being believed. That decision felt strangely peaceful. Once made, it didn't consume my thoughts. It clarified them. I stopped replaying conversations. I stopped imagining alternate outcomes. The mental noise receded. I didn't rush. There was no urgency. I understood now that time was neutral, and that patience when paired with clarity favored me. The decision wasn't to leave immediately. It was to prepare without announcing that I was preparing. I continued to show up as expected. I fulfilled responsibilities. I didn't withdraw affection or create tension. From the outside, nothing appeared different. But internally, I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. I no longer sought validation for my perceptions. I no longer needed reassurance. The question of am I overreacting dissolved completely. I knew exactly what I was responding to. This phase wasn't dramatic. It was methodical. I began to align my actions with the future I had quietly chosen, one where my presence was intentional, not assumed. The most important part of that decision was this. I accepted that clarity might cost me familiarity, that the life I was used to existed because I had made it easy for others. Removing that ease would change things, possibly end things, and I was at peace with that. The decision point wasn't about choosing sides. It was about choosing myself, not impulsively, not defensively, but decisively. Once I did, there was no need to look back. Moving in silence doesn't mean hiding. It means acting without narration. Once the decision was made, I stopped needing to explain myself to anyone, including myself. There was no emotional surge driving me forward, no urgency, just a steady sense of direction. I began with the practical. I reviewed accounts, not with suspicion, but with precision. I refamiliarized myself with timelines, obligations, and dependencies. I didn't rush to change anything. I just made sure I understood where everything stood, exactly, not approximately. At work, I continued as usual. No one noticed anything different. My competence still smoothed over gaps, but now I was selective. I solved what was required. I stopped preemptively solving what wasn't asked of me. That alone changed the texture of my days. At home, I remained calm, present, and predictable. I didn't withdraw emotionally. I didn't initiate difficult conversations. I let assumptions continue to be made, and quietly noted where they no longer aligned with my intentions. I started redirecting small things: mail, documents, access. I ensured that what needed to come to me did. Nothing secretive, just accurate. I created space, mentally first, then practically, time alone, clear boundaries around my energy. I didn't announce these changes. I simply lived them. What surprised me was how little resistance there was. Because I wasn't pushing against anything, there was nothing to push back on. My husband continued planning as though nothing had shifted. He spoke confidently about future arrangements, timelines that assumed my availability, my agreement, and my presence. I listened. I didn't correct him. Not because I was uncertain, but because his certainty was no longer relevant to my decisions. This was the phase where many people expect tension to build. It didn't. The absence of conflict made everything easier. I wasn't arguing with the present, I was preparing for a different future. And preparation, done quietly, is invisible to those who aren't looking for it. I sought advice, not emotionally, but procedurally. I asked questions framed around hypotheticals. I gathered information without triggering concern. Everything was above board, thoughtful, legal, ethical. There was no deception, just discretion. I noticed how often people mistake silence for passivity, how they equate calm with compliance. That misunderstanding worked in my favor, not because I manipulated it, but because I no longer felt compelled to correct it. I wasn't trying to surprise anyone. I was aligning my actions with reality. There were moments when I felt a flicker of sadness, not for what was ending, but for how long I'd stayed without clarity. Those moments passed quickly. They didn't slow me down. Moving in silence gave me something I hadn't felt in years: coherence. My internal and external worlds were no longer at odds. I wasn't performing understanding while suppressing awareness. I wasn't explaining away patterns that no longer deserved interpretation. I was simply acting from a place of knowing. And the thing about quiet movement is this: by the time others feel its effects, the motion is already complete. Nothing outwardly dramatic had happened yet. No confrontation, no announcement, no visible fracture. But the conditions had changed, and systems, once altered, respond in their own time. The consequences didn't announce themselves. They arrived quietly, like drafts in a house where the windows have been left open too long. At first, no one could quite identify what felt different, only that something did. Plans began to wobble. Small things. Timelines that once flowed smoothly now required clarification. Assumptions met subtle resistance, not from confrontation, but from absence. The kind of absence that can't be argued with because it isn't aggressive. I was no longer compensating. That was the shift. Where I had once anticipated needs before they were voiced, I now waited. Where I had once smoothed over friction, I allowed it to exist. Not dramatically, just naturally. And without that quiet, stabilizing force, things started to feel heavier for the people who had relied on it. My husband noticed first, though not consciously. He became slightly more irritable. Not angry, just unsettled. He double-checked things that had once just worked. He asked questions phrased as statements. "This is fine, right? You're okay with this?" I answered honestly but briefly. "Yes, I'm aware. That's your call." Those responses landed differently than my old reassurances. They didn't offer comfort. They didn't absorb responsibility. They returned ownership. At work, similar patterns emerged. Projects stalled where I'd once filled gaps without being asked. People reached out later than usual. Follow-ups increased. The system slowed, not because I withdrew effort, but because I stopped donating invisible labor. No one accused me of anything. There was nothing to accuse. I was still doing my job. I was still showing up. I just wasn't buffering consequences anymore. And consequences, when allowed to surface, make people uncomfortable. Friends began checking in with vague questions. "You seem busy lately. Everything okay?" I smiled, said I was fine, and meant it. Their concern wasn't about my well-being, it was about my availability. I noticed that clearly now. The most telling moments were the small ones. When a plan didn't come together seamlessly, and my husband looked at me instinctively, waiting for me to resolve it. And I didn't, not out of spite, out of alignment. I let him sit with the discomfort of an incomplete solution. I let silence stretch. I let responsibility remain where it belonged. That was new for him. He began to feel a loss he couldn't name. Something familiar was missing, but there was no obvious cause. I hadn't changed my tone. I hadn't withdrawn affection. I hadn't criticized. From his perspective, nothing had happened. And yet, things weren't working the way they used to. That's the thing about systems built on unacknowledged support. They feel stable until the support becomes visible by its absence. I watched carefully, not with satisfaction, but with confirmation. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be corrected with a conversation. It was a structure that only functioned when one person carried more than their share quietly. And now it didn't. The consequences didn't hurt me. They clarified things for everyone else. My husband became more controlling in small ways, seeking reassurance, asserting decisions more firmly, not because he was cruel, but because control had always been his response to uncertainty. What he didn't realize was that the uncertainty wasn't situational, it was relational, and it wasn't going away. I didn't intervene, I didn't escalate. I continued moving steadily, deliberately, in the direction I had already chosen. By the time the discomfort became noticeable enough to cause concern, it was already too late to restore the old balance, because I was no longer willing to be the one who fixed what I hadn't broken. By the time he realized something was truly wrong, the window to fix it had already closed. Not because I had shut it abruptly, but because it had been closing slowly for years, and only now did he notice the cold. The first real sign of panic came disguised as concern. He started asking questions that sounded caring on the surface, but were edged with unease. "Are you happy? Have I done something? You've been quiet lately." I answered honestly, but not expansively. "I'm fine. I'm aware of things. I've been thinking." Those responses unsettled him more than anger ever would have. There was nothing to argue with, nothing to defend against, no accusation to deflect. He tried something else. He became attentive, suddenly generous with compliments, more present, more agreeable. He suggested plans together, asked my opinion earlier than usual, framed decisions as collaborative again. If this had happened years earlier, it might have worked. But now it felt procedural, like someone patching a leak after the foundation has shifted. What he didn't understand was that I wasn't responding to behavior anymore. I was responding to structure. And the structure had already revealed itself. I could see the effort for what it was, reactive, not reflective, designed to restore comfort, not equity. He wanted the system to work again, not to understand why it had failed. And that distinction mattered. He tried to talk things through one evening, sitting across from me with a seriousness I hadn't seen in a long time. He asked what I needed, what I wanted to change. How could we get back on track? I listened carefully, and for the first time, I didn't feel tempted to explain myself. Because explaining would have meant translating years of observation into a conversation that could only absorb fragments of it. It would have meant compressing clarity into reassurance. It would have meant doing the emotional labor one last time, for the sake of resolution. I didn't want a resolution. I wanted alignment. So I told him the truth, carefully, calmly, without heat. "I'm not interested in fixing something that only works when I disappear." The room went quiet. He looked confused, then defensive, then thoughtful. He tried to argue the details, to reframe, to insist he'd never meant to hurt me. I believed him, and it didn't change anything. Intent was no longer the issue. Impact had already accumulated. He offered therapy, promises, adjustments. He said the right things in the right order. I could see him trying to catch up to a realization I'd reached long ago. But this wasn't a race. It was timing. And the timing was wrong. I wasn't angry. I wasn't closed off. I was simply done negotiating my presence. That's when he realized something irreversible had happened. Not that I was leaving, but that I had already left the version of myself that made things easy for him. And without that version, there was no way back to what we'd been. He asked if there was still a chance. I didn't answer right away, because the honest answer wasn't dramatic or cruel. It was simple. "It's too late to fix it the way you want to," I said. "Because what you're trying to fix worked for you." That was the moment the panic set in. Not loud, not explosive, just quiet regret settling in. For the first time, he had to sit with the consequences of choices he'd never thought he was making. And I didn't soften that moment. I didn't need to. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't feel like a confrontation at all. There was no raised voice, no rehearsed speech, no dramatic unveiling of evidence. By the time we sat down to talk, really talk, the emotional temperature had already cooled. That was intentional. I didn't want this moment to be fueled by anger. Anger invites defense. Defense invites denial. And denial would only drag us back into the same patterns I had already stepped out of. We sat across from each other at the same table where, months earlier, I'd first allowed myself to be honest in silence. The setting felt appropriate, ordinary, neutral, unremarkable. He started speaking first. He talked about intentions, about stress, about not realizing how things had felt from my side. He said he'd always assumed I would tell him if something was wrong, that he trusted my calm, that he thought we were okay. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I didn't counter his points one by one. I didn't correct his memory or debate his framing. I didn't need to. I believe you, I said. I believe you didn't set out to hurt me. That disarmed him more than anger would have. But intention isn't what I'm responding to anymore, I continued. I'm responding to patterns. He frowned slightly, waiting for me to elaborate. So I did, but carefully. I talked about accumulation, not incidents, about how often my agreement had been assumed, how frequently my adaptability had been relied upon without being acknowledged, how silence had been interpreted as consent, again and again. I didn't accuse, I described. I didn't say you did this to me. I said this is what happened. The difference mattered. He tried to interject once, to explain a decision he'd made years earlier. I raised my hand gently, not to silence him, but to slow the pace. I'm not asking you to relive each moment, I said. I'm telling you how they added up. There was a long pause after that. I could see him recalibrating, searching for the right response. This wasn't a fight he could win by being persuasive. There was nothing to refute. I wasn't making demands. I wasn't threatening consequences. I was stating reality. I don't need you to agree with every detail, I said. I need you to understand that the way we function depended on my shrinking, and I'm not willing to do that anymore. He asked what that meant for us. I answered without hesitation. It means I won't stay in a dynamic where my presence is optional and my silence is convenient. There was no drama in that sentence, no edge, just finality. He asked if I was saying I wanted to leave. I shook my head slightly. I'm saying I already left the version of myself that made this work. That was the truth. We sat in silence for a while after that. Not tense silence, reflective silence. The kind that settles when there's nothing left to clarify. He looked smaller somehow, not diminished, but confronted with something he hadn't known he needed to face. The cost of choices that felt harmless at the time. The weight of a system he hadn't questioned because it benefited him. I didn't feel victorious. I felt complete. When the conversation ended, there were no next steps outlined, no timeline agreed upon, no attempt to smooth the ending. That too was intentional. I wasn't negotiating an outcome, I was marking an ending. And I walked away from that table knowing I had said everything that mattered, without raising my voice, without justifying my worth, without asking to be understood. That was enough. Who I am now is not the opposite of who I was then. That's the mistake people often make when they imagine change. They expect a sharp turn, a louder voice, a harder edge, a visible transformation. But what happened to me was quieter than that, more precise. I didn't become confrontational. I didn't become bitter. I didn't become cold. I became exact. I still value calm. I still listen carefully. I still choose my words with intention. The difference is that I no longer confuse restraint with erasure. I understand now that being low maintenance made me easy to maintain, but also easy to overlook. That reliability, when unbounded, becomes an excuse for imbalance. And that silence, when habitual, teaches others how little effort they need to make. Today, my presence is not assumed. It's deliberate. I take up space without announcing it. I state preferences without apology. When something matters to me, I say so, plainly, without over-explaining. And when something doesn't align, I don't negotiate with myself first. That internal negotiation used to be constant. A quiet debate over whether I was asking for too much, feeling too deeply, expecting too much consideration. That noise is gone. In its place is something steadier. Discernment. I no longer rush to be understood. I no longer translate myself into softer language so others can stay comfortable. If someone misunderstands me now, I let that misunderstanding exist until they choose to engage more carefully. That alone has changed my relationships. Some people adjusted. They asked more questions. They slowed down. They noticed when I spoke and when I didn't. Those relationships deepened because they were no longer built on assumptions. Others drifted. Without the constant reinforcement of my availability, the connection faded. There was no conflict, just distance. I let it happen. That too was a choice. I've learned that peace isn't the absence of tension, it's the absence of self-betrayal. That being easy to be with is not a virtue if it requires you to disappear. And that quiet strength isn't about endurance. It's about knowing when endurance is no longer ethical. I don't regret the years I spent being accommodating. They taught me how systems work, how patterns form, how silence shapes outcomes. They gave me insight I carry with me now. But I don't romanticize them either. What I value most today is alignment between what I see, what I feel, and how I act. That alignment doesn't require permission. It doesn't demand recognition. It simply exists. People sometimes describe me as different now, more grounded, harder to read. I take that as a compliment, not because I want to be opaque, but because I'm no longer performing clarity for others at the expense of my own. I am still kind, still fair, still reflective, but I am no longer available for dynamics that rely on my silence. That's who I am now. There's a particular kind of ending that doesn't come with closure in the traditional sense. No final argument, no dramatic apology, no clear villain to point to. This was that kind of ending. What I learned through all of this is that harm doesn't always look like cruelty. Sometimes it looks like comfort, smooth, efficient, familiar. Sometimes it wears the face of good intentions and reasonable explanations. And sometimes it persists not because anyone is malicious, but because one person keeps absorbing the cost quietly. For a long time, I believed that being understanding was the same thing as being fair. That staying calm meant staying strong. That if I didn't make things difficult, things would eventually even out. They didn't, because systems don't correct themselves when they're working, especially when they're working for someone. The hardest truth I had to accept was this. What I thought were mistakes turned out to be deliberate choices. Not dramatic choices, not cruel ones, but repeated decisions to prioritize convenience over consideration, speed over collaboration, and certainty over curiosity. And my silence had allowed those choices to continue unchecked. That doesn't make me a victim, it makes me human. I participated in the dynamic because I believed in good faith, because I valued peace, because I trusted that care would eventually be reciprocal without needing to be requested. When I stopped participating, the system revealed itself. And that's the part I want to leave you with. You don't always need confrontation to find the truth. You don't always need proof or permission. Sometimes, all it takes is stepping back and watching what continues and what doesn't without your effort. Quiet dominance isn't about control. It's about coherence, about refusing to carry weight that was never meant to be yours alone, about choosing alignment over explanation. If you're listening to this and something feels familiar, if you've been praised for being easy, understanding, or low maintenance while feeling strangely unseen, this isn't an invitation to burn anything down. It's an invitation to look closely. Ask yourself where your silence is serving you and where it's serving everyone else. Because once you see the difference, you can't unsee it. And you don't have to announce what you're doing next. You can move quietly, you can choose deliberately, you can stop participating in dynamics that require your disappearance. And that choice, made calmly and clearly, is often the most powerful one of all. So I'll leave you with this question, one I wish I'd asked myself much earlier. Where in your life are you being appreciated for your patience, instead of being respected for your presence? If this resonated with you, I'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments, not for agreement, just for honesty. Thank you for listening.